Where does one begin to tell the many tales of the wondrous one, so very old, who today among you will believe the living secret these ancient tales still hold? Tales of the one fruit of the 12 trees of life, herb of immortality, aMBRosia, golden elixir, nectar of the gods, honey sweet, taste of divinity, great gift of the Creator, that the lame may walk and the blind may see. Wondrous tales of a living God made of flesh, born from Tanda, the golden embryo, mighty child of heaven, fountain of the water of life, ancient sacrament and sacrifice. Upon the golden tables of Olympus, aMBRosia gleams like liquid gold, its aroma a symphony of celestial delights, writes Homer, painting a vivid picture of the divine banquet halls where the gods partake of their immortal feast. Yeah. aMBRosia. According to the ancient Hindus and the Gilgamesh epic, it's a plant at the bottom of the ocean, the gift from the gods. aMBRosia, the food delivered with the nectar to drink, both every rising by doves upon Mount Olympus. It helped to turn the blood of the Greek deities into even more heavenly life force, the ichor. Athena gave the man inside the Trojan horse aMBRosia for when they'd get hungry, or in Odyssey 16:2-65. aMBRosia flows from Amalthea's horn over the head of Zeus. Mayo of Byzantium says that Zeus made an eagle immortal and took it to heaven, making them heralds of wild and ruled the winter. What is this fantastical fruit? An antiseptic, a beautifying agent, healing wounds and protecting from decay, helping to be clothed in incorruptible garments. Ancient gods and people of old used to anoint the dead with aMBRosia to make them immortal. Hera cleansed their skin with aMBRosia and myrrh, and Eidothea puts aMBRosia before Menelaus nostrils to remove the bad smell of the seal on board of the ship. For who of you has been receiving my dispensations for some time, whereas in written or oral form will be already acquainted with the garden of the Hesperides, for I have already took you down that path for a little stroll with the ladies, and yet there is where aMBRosia grows, and where the horses of the gods also feed on aMBRosia too. In mythology, aMBRosia in Greek is sometimes food and sometimes drink. The word derives from am, meaning none, and brotos, meaning deadly. And therefore, the food or the drink of immortals. It was the food of the gods that had the power to gift youth and immortality. And it was 10 times sweeter in smell and taste of honey. Teti uses aMBRosia to immerse Achilles or Hercules therein. Both aMBRosia and fire forge him immortal, just as it was usual custom of the Phoenician. And yet Peleo, frightened by that sight, stopped her. In the Iliad, Apollo washed off the blood that had coagulated from the corpse of Sarpedon, and anointed the body with aMBRosia, so to prepare it for its return into his native land that was Lycia at the time, Lyca. There's been a classicist named Arthur Wulgar-Verral that denied the evidence that this terminology, aMBRosius, had to do something necessarily with immortality, and so he preferred to translate it with fragrant, finding it a more appropriate meaning. And if that would be so, that word would derive from the Semitic term aMBR, which is amber, that when it's burned produces a raisin that is good smelling, and that all of the cultures in the East to this day attribute to it magical and seldom miraculous powers. In Europe, amber of the honey color, it was already a gift to go in the tombs, already in the Neolithic, and it is still used in the 7th century AC. The talisman that the fathers, the priests, the sacerdotes of Frisia would use. Saint Eligius warns us, saying, no woman should have the arrogance of letting a piece of amber swindle off her neck. William H. Rusher thinks both nectar and ambrosia would identify with specific kinds of honey, and that in this case, their power to confer immortality would be to the power of healing power and purification power of the honey itself, which as we know is antiseptic, and to the hydromele, to meat, honey fermented in water that came before wine as an entheogen, as a psychoactive, let's say, substance that was used in shamanic religious context and in the ancient Aegean world. This is where we meet the highly venerated and worshipped in Crete, Merope and Melissa, or even Ikore. According to Greek legend, at the beginning, Ambrosia was a wood nymph, and something happened, and unfortunately for her, Lycurgus of Thrace, of Thracia, clashed with the god Dionysus, god of wine. And this nymph got caught in the middle, and she passed and then transformed into a vine. And after the change, so the story goes, that those were carrying ambrosia, the food of the vine, to the gods of Mount Olympus. And so this is when indeed the nectar connects to Melissa. Some of you might be well versed when it comes to even just the concept of the Eleusinian mysteries, and it was a 9-day festival indeed in ancient Greece, and revolved around the worship of Demeter and Persephone, and was definitely, has always been fascinating and captivating for many, many millennia. And so many people from all over Greece and beyond, even through the analysis and comprehension of the text by Plutarch, when he says, an undoubted truth, our soul is incorruptible and immortal. Through the commemoration, during such festivals, the priestesses, the Melissas, priestesses of the bees, of Demeter, of Demetra, were very high level women in society, and they already had different rights compared to perhaps common household women, let's say. And they were quite popular at the time. My exploration begins with indeed Melissa officinalis, lemon balm in common English. And the truth is, the balm comes from the Melissa. They were just not the bee priestesses of their goddess, and yet they were also celebrated themselves as fertility goddesses. Yet they also other priestesses who celebrated various aspects of this fertility goddess, and there were different associations in different places, including bee associations like Artemis of Ephesus and Hecate and Aphrodite or Cybele or Rhea, Ishtar of Babylonia, Inanna of Sumer, snake goddess of Crete, Neith, the sister of Egypt, also all associated with bees themselves. And definitely the most famous one in Delphi, where the oracle, Lapizia, was known as the bee of Delphi. Not all the Melissa were priestesses, it is important to note, and not every priestess was known as a Melissa. Any honorable woman would qualify as Potnia or Melissa, and not all the goddesses and their priestesses were indeed associated with bees. Through these rites and through these lineages, through this golden thread, this day, this evening, each one were embodying a different role, and everything was expressed through dressing and sounds and dances, indeed. Just a little note, in Malta, it's known to the ancient Greeks as Melita, the Honeyed One. The underground temple hypogeum resonates, sound exactly the same frequency as the buzzing bees. In ancient Egyptian tradition, the bees were said to be the tears of Ra, carrier of healing and honey makers with powerful stings. Perhaps this will be a transmission on its own. Pindar, or Pindaro, mentions how one of the impieties of Tantalus was to have offered to his guests the ambrosia of the immortals, something, a thievery, very similar to the one by the hand of Prometheus. And as we're in Crete, there's something so peculiar that came to my attention. And as we go further in this current timeline that you and I and whoever is listening at any present time and now, we're approaching the promiscuity with specific machines. And we've gotten so used to handsets and house robots and so forth. But without going too far ahead in a future that is not yet here, and instead turning back and noticing that even up until the beginning of the 1900s or 1920s, perhaps even 1930s somewhere, there were automatons everywhere. And so here in Crete, there was a giant, brazen man who guarded the island by throwing stones at the ships of the passers-by and unwanted visitors. So we're talking about the very first automaton of 30,000 years ago, and his name was Talos. Talos. It reminds a little bit of tallone, like talon, right? And he was most probably created by Hephaestus, Hephaesto, and given to either Minos, or Europa as a gift. And so Talos' only weakness, as I was saying, was his ankle. And it was that he had a single vein of ichor running through his body, and this vein ran through his ankle and contained all of his life force, the blood of the gods. And it was sealed with a thin membrane of skin or a bronze nail. Medea exploited this weakness of him and killed him by bewitching him to graze his ankles on a sharp rock. And I'm going to digress a little bit because I found this to be super interesting, and there are two conflicting stories as to the origin of Talos. Because at first, when I came across it, and I honestly had completely forgotten about him, and then noticing the similarity with, the weak talon of Achilles, and so wondering, was it him instead? But okay, so two conflicting stories. One links him with Hephaestus, and after all, he's being an automata and being a creation of metal. It would make sense if he was one of his creations. And so some say that it was a gift to Minosse to help him. But the other one, as a gift from Zeus to Europa, as a token of love for her. In this second version, he's not created by Hephaestus, and is in fact the very last of the great men who had once sprung by themselves from the hash trees, and so he would be the only remaining survivor of the brazen race. So we're talking about the third of the 5 ages of men. Perhaps we can take and touch upon it in another transmission. But we don't have in front of us a man. We have an automata. We have something fashioned by either bronze or either a bronze bull, right? Because some say that he wasn't a man at all. Some say that he was in fact an animal, and some others say that he had a body of a man with a bull's head. Either way, no matter what was his fashions, he had a single vein in all his body and run all the way from his neck to his ankle. And we can see how all of his strength would be coming from the ichor, from this life fluid, from this golden blood, right? And we know that not only mortals could be made immortal by consuming and intaking ambrosia and the nectar, and yet also animals and also inanimate objects could be turned into being. And here, going again in connection with the story of Jasone and the Argonauts and Argonautis, the Argonauti, as they approach the shores of Crete, Talos notices their ship and tries to ward them off with, throwing some stones as he was instructed to do. And can you imagine if just for a second Medea wasn't with the Argonauts on board? How would the story would have gone? What would the fate of humankind would have looked like, right? And this is when some of the wording to me gets a little prickly, because the death spirits that Medea would allegedly invoke from the boat, they were called the Keres, Keres, which is very close to Kore, to Ceres, to Circe, right? I would definitely recommend for you to go and check the sources if you want to take a look at the storyline. I would say that probably the most famous account would be the story in the fourth book of Apollonius, in his Argonautica, and it should be towards the end of the book. So what's the ichor? What is this blood of the gods? What is this blood of life? I would say that for one, we must consider that this liquid, it's probably not of this earth. And it is very often repeatedly described as ethereal. And this really helps us because especially the Greek gods, they are a little bit different than many others. And through the descriptions we get to understand that they had no blood. Like no blood how we know it. And so what does it mean to have a fluid that is not like blood and that reminds a little bit of gold and at the same time having a human guise? Because like we know that these gods were mostly shapeshifters, and after all, it was not only the gods who were considered immortal in Greek myth. We know that the Titans, for example, primordial ancestors and enemies of the Greek gods of Olympus, they also bled ichor. And this definitely strengthened the connection between this fluid and immortality for me. So it is not just the divine who are immortal, and instead all those who bleed ichor. And we know that it was extremely dangerous substance. It was deadly to humans, and anyone who touched the liquid would be poisoned and die almost instantly sometimes. And such details, I find the fact that it's mentioned, it tells you something. There is something else about the mortals of the Greek mythology. They could bleed. I honestly haven't heard many people talk about this. And so there's an episode which in Homer's Iliad, for example, when the goddess Aphrodite rushes to protect Aeneas, the hero of Troy, a very brutal attack from the Greek Diomede. And this drives the latter into a pretty big fit and turns back to Aphrodite and slices her at the wrist. And so it was not blood, but ichor, which started spilling out and spilling from her wrist. The goddess, of course, like starts recoiling in pain, and this kind of springing of liquid kind of drives back Diomede, because once again, such substance, it's very dangerous for mortals. And this is kind of revealing, right? The gods are consuming and drinking aMBRosia. And they drink nectar, and this is why they bleed ichor, right? And so Homer, for example, he describes as the drink and the food exactly as the same thing, including what is that runs through the vein. And he goes further and he makes the link between the diet and the blood and the god's immortality, highlighting that also the immortals somehow could bleed and get injured and sometimes also die. And all of these are, I find, very interesting facts. It kind of sounds like stick to this kind of diet and you surely shall reach immortality. The word used by Homer, it's very telling and peculiar, for he uses the word to describe the liquid as aMBRoton, and a privative alpha, which negates what follows, and brotos, meaning blood or other bodily fluids, implies that the wound was without blood. aBrotos means without mortality, you see. And so this spatial fluid elsewhere gives life to lifelessness, as we just saw in the case of Talus, the giant. And I really cared to share that with you, for it's one of the oldest Greek myths and predates the golden age of Homer. and it comes from Minoans in ancient Crete. So it's older than the Odyssey and Iliad. And I find the connection with Metropolis and Frankenstein very fitting and timely with what is occurring at this time, even in the cinema, even in the screens and all of the influences that we keep on receiving across time and space. It honestly sounds way better to be looking like Bronzo di Riace, like a brazen god with one single tube of immortal liquid, rather than some patchwork of being. But what would I know? It seems that, at least not for the Greeks, the mankind was not created in the image of the gods at all in the end, and much rather the gods choosing to look like us, to be sure to look like us for some reason. But yet, indeed, they were very different entities. J.R.R. Tolkien helps honestly come to mind too. So long lived and yet ultimately mortal beings. I find an element that is connected to a passage in the Bible. If you were to take your scripture to John 3:5, we have Jesus using the phrase born of water in answer to Nicodemus' question about how to enter the kingdom of heaven. Not sure if you remember that, but just in case, I'm just gonna give it a read. He told Nicodemus that he must be born again. John 3:3. And so the latter questions how such thing could happen, and when he was, such a grown old man. And Jesus answered, "Verily, very truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born of water and the Spirit." Of one thing I'm certain, we're not talking about water of baptism, for Jesus was not teaching that one must be baptized in water in order to be saved or receive the grace, and we're not going to enter into that specifically today. And so to be born of water, to be rebirthed spiritually. For example, Ezekiel 36:25 says, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean, and I shall cleanse you from all your impurities." You can also see Psalms 51:2-7 and Numbers 19:17-19. And there's some passages in the New Testament too, if you want to take a look. To be born of water, different than to be born the Spirit. And so if we know the Spirit is in part already with us since birth and conception, the water perhaps is a heavenly water, perhaps is that pure living water that should only quench one's thirst and satiate. What if that was in fact ichor? What if that was all at once ambrosia, manna, or nectar? We might picture this kind of fluid like a super fuel, a super diesel, brewed from an exclusive diet. Only those within the garden, or only those allowed to enter the Garden of the Spiritus. And if this is the first time that you tune in, I invite you to listen and receive the previous transmission. We know that only few, only selected beings had access to this. They had to consume ambrosia and nectar, and eating like that, without the wine and bread the humans and mortals relied on, was essential and crucial. It kept them immortal. If some humans tried to put their hands on some, it would be corroding them, or like corrosive or lethal if touched. This is the drawing of the line between those on Olympus and everyone else down below. And Homer's Iliad gives us the most famous picture, as I just shared with you, about Aphrodite. And I quote, "And forth flowed the goddess' immortal blood, ichor, such as flows in the blessed gods. For they eat no bread, neither drink they flaming wine. Wherefore they are bloodless, and they are called immortal." This was an English translation by A.T. Murray, Loeb Classical Library, 1924, of the book 5 in the Iliad. This is the scene that introduces ancient Greek ichor and explains how these were not merely abstract ideas, and yet creatures with real supernatural powers. And a couple of human flaws, for sure. But we're describing here bodies that can get hurt and that don't just simply bleed like a human being and die. This is the substance that physically made a god different than their followers. I know what you might think. Many of you, and many that you know, nowadays probably don't believe anymore in golden-blooded gods, obviously. And yet, maybe I do a little bit. And yet, whereas some of these things are to be taken literally or not, I know that the fascination for the divine and the unique, and the fascination for the supernatural and the individual markings, say, details that make one being different than another. Whereas this is to be considered or found to be true or not, I find this single golden thread to be very effective. First and foremost, for it managed to stick around for so long, and in so many different languages and translations up to this day to us. And at the same time, very detailed picture painted for us in metaphor or clothed into the fashion of such stories in order to spark our imagination and perhaps a little bit our compassion when it comes to embracing this journey of growth, mastery, and vulnerability, I'd say. For it shows us again and again to dive and how to jump and how to fall and how to get back up again when it comes about being human and divine power and the gap that is in between and the human attempt to mind the gap, to fill the gap, and perhaps build a bridge, or perhaps a very whimsical way to make us notice. And I'm paraphrasing right now, Siddhartha, notice that we already are on the other side of the river. And also this personification, this fact that these gods are similar to humans and close to them in a lot of ways. It helps us to accept our true nature and the nature of power and the boundaries and borders in our own lives and the struggles, and reflect upon this magic mystery that life is, and most likely how to take us a little bit less for granted and sometimes a little bit less seriously. Circe mentions to Odysseus how in fact aMBRosia reached her island from Olympus. It is important to note that the word aMBRosia, and in the case of the neutral plural in the ancient Greek has been used to call specific festivities in honor of Dionysus, probably for the predominance of festivities and feasts connected to them. Ambrosia is indeed connected to Amrita from the Hindu culture, a famous holy drink that grants immortality to the gods. A lot of postmodern historians, amongst which Dennis Staples, they place ambrosia in relation to the hallucinogenic fungus Fungo Amanita muscaria. The evidence can be summarized in what food the centaurs ate, which suggests that satyrs, centaurs, horse totem tribesmen, and their men womenfolk used these brews to wash down mouthfuls of far stronger drug. Some hours of these ecstasies are followed by complete inertia, phenomenon that would account for the story of how Lycurgus, armed only with an ox goad, routed Dionysus' drunken army of Maenads and satyrs after its victorious return from India. To quote Robert directly from Majorca, Spain, from the Greek myths, I've had second thoughts about the drunken god Dionysus, about the centaurs, with their contradictory reputation for wisdom and misdemeanor, and about the nature of divine ambrosia and nectar. These subjects are closely related because the centaurs worshipped Dionysus, whose wild autumnal feast was called the aMBRosia. I no longer believe that when his Maenads ran raging around the countryside, tearing animals or children in pieces and boasted afterwards of traveling to India, they had intoxicated themselves solely on wine or ivy ale. The stained glass image, as you can see right now, depicts mushrooms encoded with a centaur in Chartres Cathedral, Eure-et-Loire, in France, 1217. This is a photograph by Manuel Cohen. And the evidence, which is summarized in Graves' manuscript, What Food the Centaurs Ate from 1958, suggests the satyrs, these goat totem tribesmen and centaurs, horse totem tribesmen, and their Maenad womenfolk used these brews to wash down mouthfuls of a far stronger drug, namely a raw mushroom, Amanita, which includes hallucination, senseless rioting, prophetic sight, erotic energy, and remarkable muscular strength. I find it very peculiar and interesting that on an Etruscan mirror, the Amanita muscaria is engraved at the Ixian feet, and there was a Thessalian hero who feasted on ambrosia amongst the gods. And several myths are consistent with my theory that the centaurs ate this mushroom. According to some historians, it was later employed by the Norse berserks to give them reckless power in battle. I don't know about you guys, but I now to see how ambrosia and nectar were intoxicant mushrooms, so they could have been even perhaps a smaller one, like a Panellus papillonaceus, which induced just harmless and simple hallucinations. Amongst the Mazatec Indians of Oaxaca province in Mexico, priestess invokes Tlaloc, the mushroom god, and seen transcendental visions. Tlaloc was engendered by lightning, and so was Dionysus. In Greek folklore, as in the Mazatec, so are all mushrooms proverbially called food of the gods in both languages. Tlaloc wore a serpent crown, and so did Dionyso. Tlaloc had an underwater retreat, and so did he. The Maenad savage custom of tearing off their victim heads might probably refer allegorically to tearing off the sacred mushroom head. One particular thing that I found is that in Mexico, they never eat the stalk, only the head. When reading the Perseus, sacred king of Argos, converted to Dionysus' worship and named Mycenae after a toadstool which he found growing on site and which gave forth a stream of water. Kind of sounds like that if we dig deep enough, man, everything is a mushroom. And Tlaloc, at the same time, her emblem was a toad. And so it was that Argos had the same emblem. And that from the mouth of Tlaloc's toad in the Tepentitla fresco issues a stream of water. When looking at Ambrosia artemisifolia, we know that it's a genre of plants appertaining to the family of Asteraceae. The name derives from Greek word that used to point at the foot of the gods. Doesn't Asteraceo sounds like Asherah? It does to me, or Astarte? Definitely. In the Odyssey, Homer describes as the nymph Calypso is setting a table with ambrosia and the rosy red nectar for the god Hermes. Later on, the Cyclops Polyphemus likens the wine that Odysseus gave him to nectar, demonstrating its reputation for sublime taste. At death, the Norse believe that the chosen hero is welcomed at Valhalla by Valkyries bearing the drinking horn at the horn gate, containing the beautifully and suggestively named mead of inspiration, which in Gaelic is the Dirkflaith of sovereignty, and in Greek the wine of Persephone. Is it the red rosy drink of Calypso served to Hermes and the wine of Persephone one and the same?